What we've seen across our data set, which is about 15 million transactions a month.
Something to give me quick signal so that I'm not wasting a bunch of time and effort and money.
Our lead data scientist has a Ph.D. in Astrophysics.
Insights into the innovations and revolutions of the marketing world. Welcome to the Marketing Scientists Podcast. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Marketing Scientists. Today, we're talking to Matt, who's the CEO and co-founder of Faring. This is a post-purchase survey company that started working with DTC brands, e-commerce brands, and they're now working with some non-e-commerce customers as well in the SaaS space and the tech space. We talked a lot about all the different ways in which you can do post-purchase surveys right and all the ways in which you can do it wrong. Some of the data science behind it, some of the lessons he's had about how to do this well. So there's a lot of gold in here. All right, Matt, this is going to be spicy. This is going to be fun because we're going to talk about Faring and the world of post-purchase surveys. I'm sure you call them something else. That's just the first thing that came to my mind. So I want to start with your journey behind Faring itself. What got you to build this company? What was happening in your world that got you excited about building this business?
Yes. Going back to 2010, 2011, when I got into e-commerce, back when kind of D2C and brands were all the rage, it was all online retailers. I was a merchant for about 7 years, kind of earlier in my career. So I was on that side of the table, was an early employee at a headphone company here in New York. And my journey to Faring has a little bit of a stepping stone in there. And so I left that headphone company in the summer of 2016, really enamored with same-day delivery. And I don't want same-day delivery to overtake our conversation, but in 2016, Uber Rush and Postmates both had APIs. And these APIs allowed you to essentially call an API with order details, with a pickup and a drop-off location. And at the time, I was just enamored with this. So at the headphone company, we were one of the first to integrate with both Uber Rush and Postmates. We were delivering headphones in New York. And so I left that company really to build a business in the same-day delivery space. It started off more as like a marketplace. I was like, how do I create more demand at the top of the funnel? Turned into a B2B SaaS. And we did that for about 18 months and never really found product market fit. So we ended up having about 15 customers. I get asked all the time, how do I know when I have product market fit? And having built Faring and having had that company, I could tell you, you don't even need to ask yourself the question. You'll know when you have it. But about 18 months into that journey, when we were kind of just starting to take some consulting to offset our burn and do more work, one of the brands that was working with us for same days, a handbag company here in New York called Kara, was doing all this influencer gifting. So he was gifting bags to a ton of influencers who would then post about it. They were trying to track with vanity URLs and discount codes. Working with him, funny enough, for the same day, just kind of was more consultative at that point. So he was asking, he's like, we're doing all this gifting. We're about to turn this off. How should I track this? So I suggested to him, hey, just go use a survey post-purchase and just ask customers. Let's just try to not use GA and get all complicated with this. And at the time, there was a Shopify app that allowed you to add code to the thank you page. It wasn't native like it came into, or they launched a few years after. And we ended up using a Google form, embedded Google form, which is just an iframe, which means it's not attached to the information, the transaction information at all. So what ended up happening for that brand, he was getting all this really meaningful data, but he had no clue who was submitting these responses. That was kind of where the idea came about. I was like, why doesn't a survey app exist in the Shopify space that just allows you to ask questions post-purchase, mainly attribution-related questions, and join that to transaction data for reporting, AOV reporting and revenue reporting. So that was really the catalyst that got us going. And I think we were definitely I wouldn't say willing to do anything, but we were feeling the negative effects of lack of product market fit. So I remember so clearly turning to my co-founder, who's Faring CTO, and being like, how do you feel about us stopping the same day stuff? And this came out of absolutely nowhere. stopping the same day delivery stuff for a couple of weeks and building a Shopify app that is a post-purchase survey. So that's how we got started. It was like, I think we opened the repo in like March 15th. We had the first customer live, which was Kara, on like April 5th. And then we went live in the App Store in May of 2018. So that was the journey of a fairly large pivot, I'd say. But at the previous headphone company, I ended up running logistics and digital marketing. So I was overseeing both areas, and it was almost just like a pivot from one vertical to another.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, so now fast forward to 6 years, right? Now we're sitting in 2020, well, almost 7 years, 5. And the question that I have for you is like, when people come to you, right? Like when people are talking to your sales team or talking to you this week, next week, what's top of mind for them? What is the real problem that they're trying to solve where they're thinking about faring?
Yeah, there's usually two vectors that people come in, or two problems they're trying to solve. One of them is around trusts when it comes to other measurement. It's just like something is looking off, let's say. And they're like, okay, we need a way to think about this or get some third-party validation, and post-purchase surveys are a great way to do that. The other area is a brand will start to diversify into new channels, let's say away from Meta and into audio. And the measurement stack for audio is very different than the measurement stack for Meta. There's obviously some crossover, but the efficacy of each solution is different. And so those are usually the two different entry points that we talk to. It's either channel specific or kind of trust. How do we validate the data that we're currently making decisions on?
Got it. Okay, that's a really important couple of points here. So one is about establishing trust of other methodologies, whether they're using multi-touch attribution or they're just using last touch attribution or they're using MMM or incrementality testing. And they're like, hey, I want to get another read. And this is helpful to, increase my confidence level in where do I go next. And the second one is like, I imagine the second one is a little bit more for smaller brands where they're starting to diversify their channels. They don't have a ton of measurement in place, but they're like, I need something to like give me quick signal so that I'm not like wasting a bunch of time and effort and money. That's really interesting. Okay. So have you seen brands like do some interesting stuff as a result of seeing their faring data? I'm sure you've got examples or stories of this. So talk me through a couple if anything comes to mind.
Yeah, the classic story we hear once a week is a channel looks like it's not performing. That's measured usually like some pixel-based or platform reported metric. They look at their faring data and it's like, this is clearly working. To that what extent obviously requires a little bit of digging, but it's like, hey, this is showing a negative ROAS, but if I look at my faring data, it's showing like a 2.5x. Like, how is this happening? So that's definitely the biggest kind of aha moment that customers have. One thing I love about the company we're building is the time to value with attribution surveys is like just so quick because it's like a totally new data point that brands did not have previously. And whether they're looking at something click-based or MMM, depending on what cycle they're looking at, it's like all of a sudden I have this voice of the customer, which is more like a legacy phrasing of that. But they have this new input directly from their customers that doesn't involve inference. If we think about other methodologies, like there's nothing that's like we can run tests and do different types of measurement, but they all to some extent use an inference where like this is quite different where you're just asking and you're getting what is in that customer's brain out, which is very effective and like quite accurate.
That's a great point. So, I have a bunch of questions that I want to go, but let's start with this one. So you mentioned something about you're getting what is in people's brain, right? And getting that out. One of the, and this is really coming from a genuine place, like from a place of learning. So I hope you don't mind me sort of moving in this direction, right? One of the things that I read about or have this perception that, hey, isn't there some recency bias or recall bias? And I'm sure you get that all the time. So how do you talk to customers or people in the industry about that when it comes to post-purchase service?
Yeah, it comes down to the phrasing of the question, how did you hear about us or how did you first hear about us? at least with our research so far, it doesn't really matter as much how you're asking it on the more tactical level. But the recency bias is definitely an issue. But we would argue that the channel that the customer responds with is arguably the most influential channel, even though the question isn't necessarily wording that would be almost too difficult from a phrasing perspective, like what channel influence you the most, very marketing lingo. So we get over it that way. Recency bias is definitely more of an issue with like legacy. Hey, this brand has been around for like 6 years. It's like, I don't know how I discovered this brand. So there's a little bit of that, but what we would argue, if you're allocating your budget into the channels that the customer is responding with, you're going to be much better aligned with what drove that purchase versus maybe what was that top, like the most top of funnel discovery point. So that's how we get around recency bias on the more tactical level. Yeah, does that make sense?
It does. It does. Okay. So on that point, right? So one of the things that I sort of talk about with folks is the phrasing of the question, the setup of the question, the best practices around survey design. Tell us what you have seen now that you have 6 years, 7 years of history. Give us some like practical tips. What are must do's versus definitely don't do's when it comes to designing those surveys?
Yeah. So what we want to aim for is matching what is in your customer's head. So if they received, let's say, a postcard in the mail, and that's how the consumer refers to it, that is the language you want to use. You of course don't want to use marketing lingo like direct mail, because everyone's going to be quite confused. So that's kind of step one, is like making sure that the response options are written in the consumer's mind. Again, we're trying to, one of our more product visions is like decoding customer minds. Like what is in there and how do we get that down as a data point for the brand? So that's step one, is making sure there's like high efficacy of like, what am I thinking and what is here? The second level is really focusing on kind of channels. And this is, we did some research last summer with a methodologist, essentially just use a sample and did some paneling, trying to understand how do consumers think of product discovery. And what we discovered there is that consumers think channel first. So they're not thinking like at the more like deeper level, like it was an app. They're thinking Instagram first. We can always follow up and get better data by kind of diving in with our secondary questions. But consumers on the thing think channel first, then ad or influencer, kind of in kind of lower there. So those are probably the two kind of guiding points. We often see like brands use like online advertisement. Like that's probably the worst way to think about this. Or to phrase these things is just very marketing focused, or even social media. It's just too broad and generalized when a consumer is thinking of how they discovered a brand. They're not thinking of social media, like they're thinking Instagram or TikTok or the very specific channel that they were browsing on. So those are probably the two main points to harp on when designing the response options and writing the question.
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. Very often in post-purchase surveys, you see something like Google if you leave it open text, or so my related question here is open text versus giving options versus some mix of both. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so funny enough, we would want everyone to hear this entire sentence here, but we'd almost prefer people use open text only. And hear me out, and that's not what we're ultimately going to recommend, but that from a data accuracy perspective, if the consumer is writing something in, we're removing any kind of, whether it's order bias or things that we try to negate with randomization and other points. So a good example of that is everyone knows how AppLovin has been scaling in Q4. And we had brands who were like, how do I measure this? And like our advice is like, actually don't add it to your survey. Like we want the most raw response data possible. And if consumers are writing in like game ad or the name of a game, like we know that there's a pretty high influence here. It also allows us to discover how they word channels and how they think about channels. So that's actually the preferred accuracy mechanism. The most difficult part with that is your response rate is going to drop pretty dramatically, like by 75%. And at a certain point, which we could get into, but at a certain point when you're extrapolating to the whole, it gets very variable. And so it's kind of like this double-edged sword is like, okay, we do understand that more accurate data would come in via open-ended, but you're going to capture much less of it, which will not allow you to extrapolate to the whole, to the entire kind of order revenue. So we kind of meet in the middle there with kind of what we suggest, but we do recommend getting a baseline. And so if you're starting to advertise on a channel, do add it to your survey. Like no one's going to write something in that didn't necessarily happen. There's some noise there. So we do recommend that. But if you're very curious of like, is this channel working at all? There is an argument if it's higher volume to actually not add it when you go live, just to see the incremental amount of people who are taking the time and submitting it into that open-ended response.
And I also wonder if it's a good idea when you're starting, go open text first for the first few months, and then learn the patterns and the language to then turn it into options, and always still have an open-ended one. Okay, that's a good one. How many options is too many? I've seen forums where there's like 15 options, and I'm like, oh. And the part of my struggle is, did I see it on Twitter? Did I see it on LinkedIn? Did I see it on Instagram? I forget, because maybe I saw it in all three places. So any tips or thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the response count was there's a lot of mechanics at play here. So what we've seen across our data set, which is about 15 million transactions a month, is the response count doesn't necessarily affect the completion rate. Surprisingly. So you'd think paradox of choice, a lot of options, less people are submitting. So on the average, it's not a huge determinant in the completion rate. There's obviously exceptions to that. I mean, there's other variables that we can't necessarily totally control for if there's like a ton of scripts loading on the page. So that's one thing to note is we don't expect a huge drop in completion rate when you add more options. The other important thing to know is when you're extrapolating to the whole, the variability in that extrapolation increases with the amount of responses by about 15 or 20%. So there is an argument if you are extrapolating this, which the large majority of our customers are doing, which they should do, is you actually don't want too many options because that's going to create some more noise there. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword where it's not going to reduce completion rates dramatically. And if you do add too many, it will kind of add essentially some noise into the extrapolation. So this is one of the focuses of ours this year is how do we ask these questions in a more intelligent way where we do show less options. We don't reduce data, kind of the fidelity of the data. So we're able to get higher completion rates and higher extrapolation accuracy by just asking the question a little bit differently.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's a really interesting point. So if you're doing extrapolation, which means you're doing the survey for maybe 5% of your audience, but then using that to kind of, predict the 100%. And if you have too many options, then the noise from a data science perspective just becomes too much in that extrapolation sort of game, which is why you want to sort of balance the two. That's super helpful. Now, you and I were also talking about this in December when we got to know each other, that you're investing a ton in data science. So talk to us about where those investments are going. What is the type of data science work that you're doing?
One thing that we often hear from customers is attribution surveys and post-purchase surveys are directional, or they're kind of add-on to a different methodology. So our big focus this year is like, how do we increase trust in the data that customers are capturing? And the joy of Fairing versus other survey solutions like a SurveyMonkey is like, we are very purpose-built. Like we know why customers are using us. And we almost want to put guardrails on how customers use us so that we could get better output for them. So it's less of we view ourselves less as like a feedback tool where it's like, send this to a bunch of customers, send a survey to a bunch of customers and get all this qualitative data that you could then come through. And more so, how do we provide guardrails so that customers think of Fairing more as a measurement tool and methodology than just a feedback tool that then has to kind of used as a sidecar in some of your larger decisions. So that's where a lot of this is coming from, is like, how do we improve accuracy and at our volume, and with the fact that we can start to we can measure these things in different ways is really what's shifted us in this direction. And it's been, our whole team is super excited and energized about helping solve this problem on much deeper levels. But it does come down to like us forcing ourselves to focus on very particular ways in which customers are using that. So that's one way. And then from a process perspective, a lot of it comes down to normalization. How do we normalize questions, responses across all our thousands of customers to provide kind of better level of insights and prediction in the app at scale?
Can you explain to our audience, what does normalization mean?
Yeah, the easiest way to think about it is having a defined label to a response across all of our stores. And so one brand might use for word of mouth, they might use friend or family. Another brand might use friend or colleague. Like these to us are extremely similar response options. They're the same channel. And how do we create the normalization layer allows us to not necessarily query text, but query something that's a label on that text, which allows us to do more interesting things with the output of the data. So that's what we're doing. We're also very excited about what this solves externally. So we get asked all the time from third parties. They're like, I want to ingest fairing data. And part of our goal is like, how do we turn survey data into something that's more analogous to click data, where like, you just connect an API, you're good to go. And so a lot of third parties are excited to ingest fairing data, but think about like, if you're a different tool, like what you guys do, for example, is like, how do I think about like all these variations of word of mouth, or somebody has Facebook and Instagram? Like, how do I ingest this data without building a mapping tool in my products to then normalize it on our side? So we're trying to solve that for yourself and all the other measurement players and platforms, et cetera, so that they can start to rely on this data. And you combine that with some accuracy prediction, and then we get to something that actually starts to look pretty close to a click or pixel fire.
Very cool. Okay, I'm going to ask you a couple of last questions here before we wrap up. So the one thing is, you've been in this space for the last, both as an operator and now as a SaaS vendor for like decade plus. What's your view on touch-based attribution, MMM, incrementality? Like, what's your general take on the whole ecosystem? What's the future? What's the next 5 years look like? Is everyone going to be doing incrementality and post-purchase, or do you see sort of the continuation of what's been happening in the last 10 years? Like, where are we going as an industry?
Yeah, our view is different channels require different methodologies, and that's not going to change. So there's most certainly not going to be a one methodology solves this for everything. Arguably, like surveys we're in like a very good place for this because we're so unbiased and you can capture every channel. But different channels require different tools. So that's how I see this starting to progress. I am excited about more of the causal analysis that brands are doing for the first time, or at least that's happening at scale for the first time with vendors. So that's definitely the most exciting. Things like MTA, there might be a place for it. I've always been bullish on like extremely simplified MTA. And so let's not think about every touch point. Let's think about maybe the survey response and then the last touch. So it's like discovery and what drove final click. So that's how we think about MTA. MTA is also good for creative testing. I guess it's more just like understanding user behavior on landing pages. It's a little bit less MTA-ish, but more a click-based methodology for measurement. But definitely more excited on the MMM, more regression analysis coming to everyone in the incrementality side of things. But these things, like I'm excited to talk to you about this when we launch our podcast. But these things are very difficult and they can go wrong quite quickly. So removing all of the noise from, let's say, an incrementality test is quite difficult. There could be remnant ad placements, there could like influencers, et cetera. So I think we all have a lot to learn, but it's definitely moving in the right direction. And the crazy thing to me, and I think Google did this to themselves, but it's like the fact that GA has almost like disappeared. Like we still hear it quite often. I'd love to look at like the growth rate of our GA integration and just see if it's slowed down at all, which I haven't looked at, but it is wild to me how brands have moved away from that. And now they're looking at in-platform tools like Paramark, tools like Farron, and less so relying on the more bottoms-up approach. So that's something I definitely don't see going away. Unless somebody like another vendor comes out that is a better Google Analytics, but I think the time has already passed for that. If we think about cross-device and all the issues that come with that. So on our marketing site, I still have GA installed, but I started using PostHog about 4 months ago, like
Right.
on our growth side, because I was like, I just need a simple source medium. I need to look at entry, bounce rate, exit, like that's it. Like, so that's my general view on the space right now.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that the key takeaway for me was the move towards understanding the causal ways of thinking, right? Which is much more about sort of understanding the cause and effect relationships between, hey, I did something in this marketing channel and I can somehow, whether through correlation or causation, sort of see the impact of that on my business metrics. And if I don't, then what are we even talking about? Okay, cool. So that's helpful. And then the last thing that I'm actually really curious about, and this podcast is called The Marketing Scientists, and I'm always looking for the science. So have you seen any interesting academic research? Have you sort of, since you work with a large data set, do you collaborate with academics on this type of research? I'm just curious if there are sort of pointers and you would say, hey, go read that paper or go read that, professor sort of work in this area. I'd be very curious about that.
There's no, at least to my knowledge, there's no research papers published yet. We're starting to push in that direction to work with more people and kind of on the EDU side. So yeah, nothing as of yet, like surprisingly. And I think that's our job to start to push this. And that's why the stuff that we're working on is like integrating like A/B testing into our platform. It's like, how do we improve accuracy? How do we actually treat this like a scientific process of how do we get better data versus just hard-coded questions or just analyzing the output? So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. And that's a big unlock for us, which you alluded to before, is we hired our lead data scientist has a Ph.D. in astrophysics. Like, she knows this process of how do we get to better answers. So that's the approach that we're taking in improving this data. But yeah, nothing as of yet. I've been reading a lot on just like, there's so much research on display ads, funny enough. I think more will come out now that the space is like a little bit, not in disarray, but changing over the last 3 or 4 years. So I'm expecting more, but yeah, nothing.
Cool. I think there's an opportunity for you all to do something interesting with, some of the business schools, some of the marketing schools. I think Wharton does a bunch of research. There's an institute called the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. I don't know if you've heard of them in Australia. They do a lot of research with large retailers and, consumer goods companies around marketing effectiveness and efficiency and how brands grow and stuff like that. So there's some interesting ideas there for you all. Well, this was fantastic. I lied. I have one last question for you. We talked a ton about post-purchase surveys. Are there other use cases that people are using Fairing for? If there are, would love to wrap up the show on that note.
Yeah, totally. So our core focus at Fairing is measurement. So that's a lot of the product work you're going to see come out is measurement based, and attribution surveys are what we refer to them, and they could live pre-purchase too. But other use cases in the e-commerce world, there's kind of 4 that we group this into. So attribution is one. The second one is personalization and segmentation. And so this is, think about it like any data point that you could capture from a customer that would then let you personalize a message thereafter. My favorite question for this is, how would you describe yourself with predefined options? You pipe that data to your ESP, to Klaviyo, whatever tool you're using, and now you have this beautiful new deterministic data point provided by the customer into the type of content they want to hear. So that's usually the biggest kind of next step that we recommend our customers ask. And you're kind of just filling out a profile with Fairing the way our question stream works. It's not like this survey interrogatory way of asking these questions. The third category is just, we call it generalized research. It's like demographic, psychographic, age, gender, etc. There's ways to get that from third parties too. So I'm not going to be as bullish on that just because there's other ways to solve that, but very, very easy way to get. You could be in a meeting, add a question. If you're at a certain amount of volume, by the next day, you have a pretty clear indicator of like, hey, what is the maybe gender of my customers? And then the last one is conversion rate optimization. So this is kind of like the layup. We recommend adding it to the end of the question stream for all customers who are using us as a post-purchase survey. Questions like, how was your shopping experience, are just, it's just gold, especially for CRO or heads of digital product who are looking like, how do I optimize? Like, what is my next step? Is it changing the button color? And if you just start asking customers at scale, you will just get a list. It's almost like this to-do list of things to optimize or things that aren't clear, because the customers who are frustrated will tell you, like, your return policy was not clear, or I couldn't find how fast it's going to ship it. So all things that add up to create this beautiful CRO checklist. So those are kind of the core four that we push that provide arguably like immense value post-purchase.
That's a great list, and what a place to wrap this up. So thank you, Matt, for coming on. I'm excited about doing this again soon, and excited to see your growth in 2025. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks so much for Neil. This is a fun conversation.